414 B-29 bombers were lost bombing Japan, 147 to the enemy, 267 to their own engines. The Wright R-3350, 18 cylinders, 3,350 cubic inches, was supposed to win the Pacific War. Instead, it burned down more superfortresses than Japanese fighters and flak combined. The crankcase was magnesium, a metal that burns at 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit. How did the engine that killed more bomber crews than the enemy become the most efficient piston engine ever built? The loss ledger for B-29s in the Pacific War reads like a mechanic's nightmare. Out of 414 bombers lost on missions against Japan, only 147 fell to enemy action, flak, fighters, or night interceptors. The remaining 267 vanished to operational causes. That's not just a number, it's a ratio. For every B-29 shot down by the Japanese, nearly 2 were destroyed by their own machinery. The figures are drawn straight from Army Air Force's Statistical Digest, Table 165, compiled at the end of the war by officers who had to account for every missing airframe, every crew that didn't come home. Operational losses meant takeoff crashes, mid-air fires, forced ditchings, and disappearances on the return leg, almost always with the same root: engine failure. The R-3350 became infamous among crews for its unpredictability. In the ready rooms and maintenance hangars, the joke was bitter. We're being killed more by Curtiss Wright than by the Japanese. These numbers weren't abstract. Each entry in the loss column meant 11 men, pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and gunners gone. The enemy didn't get them. Their own engines did. The mechanics who signed off each pre-flight, the engineers who traced burned wiring and melted spars in the aftermath, all knew the pattern. Magnesium crankcases burned white hot, oil leaks turned minor faults into infernos, and cooling systems couldn't keep up with the demands of a fully loaded bomber clawing for altitude in tropical heat. The numbers tell the story, but they don't explain the mechanism. Those are the numbers. Now, what was actually happening inside the engine to cause this? February 18, 1943, Seattle. Edmund T. Allen, Boeing's chief test pilot and a veteran of high-risk prototype flights, took the second XB-29 aloft for a routine maximum speed stability run. 45 minutes in, the bomber tore apart above the city. The wreckage slammed into the Fry meat packing plant, killing Allen, his 4-man crew, and 27 people on the ground. Army Air Force's accident report, number 45-2-18-1, pinned the cause not on the engine but on a structural failure, weak rivets, and an airframe never meant for the speeds it reached that day. Yet the crash was a warning. The B-29's complexity and unproven systems had already claimed lives before a single bomber reached the front. Allen's death sent ripples through the engineering community. He had survived a previous XB-29 fire by feathering an engine and gliding a burning prototype home, earning an Air Medal for saving the program. This time, the margin of error ran out. The Army's Statistical Digest later laid out the pattern in cold numbers. B-29s posted an accident rate of 12.5 per 100,000 flight hours, double the B-17's 6.2 and well above the B-24's 7.1. 32 people lost in a single test flight, hundreds more in operational crashes, all before enemy action was even a factor. In the hangars, engineers and mechanics studied every twisted spar and scorched nacelle, searching for answers. The cause of Allen's crash was structural, but the broader pattern was mechanical. Each new entry in the loss ledger pointed to a design pushed past its limits. The question lingered, unresolved. What was happening inside these engines that made the B-29 so deadly to its own crews? The R-3350 was not a small engine. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows displaced 3,350 cubic inches over 54 liters. At takeoff, the engine could deliver 2,200 horsepower at 2,800 revolutions per minute, numbers that read like a promise of brute force. But inside the nacelle, every pound counted. Curtiss Wright engineers chose magnesium alloy for the crankcase to save weight, hundreds of pounds per engine, despite its well-known volatility. Magnesium burns at over 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit. a temperature that turns aluminum wing spars into molten runoff in seconds. In the event of a fire, standard extinguishers, carbon dioxide or water, were useless. Once magnesium ignited, it burned with a ferocity that nothing on board could stop. The rest of the engine was a catalogue of ambitious design: twin-row radial cylinders, a supercharger for high-altitude performance, and a tightly packed accessory section. The B-29's nacelle left little margin for airflow around the rear cylinders. Cooling, always a challenge in a radial, became a race against heat soak and friction. The R-3350's architecture on paper was a marvel of American engineering. In practice, it was a system perched on the edge of thermal runaway, with every material choice and mechanical clearance setting the stage for what came next. Ground crews in the Marianas faced a maintenance schedule that bordered on the impossible. The official time between overhaul for the R-3350 was just 100 to 200 hours, a fraction of what mechanics expected from a heavy bomber engine. In practice, the top 5 cylinders on each engine came off every 25 hours, whether the aircraft had seen combat or not. Full engine replacements were scheduled every 75 hours, sometimes sooner if oil analysis or vibration checks hinted at trouble. Wartime summaries from the 20th Air Force logistics staff document the relentless pace. Engines stacked in crates, spare cylinders lined up in rows, and crews working through the night to keep a single B-29 on the line. By the end of the war, 3,970 B-29s had been built, but the flow of replacement parts and engines rarely kept up with demand. Each sortie risked pushing an engine past its safe margin. The maintenance logs show a pattern. Wear and fatigue accumulated faster than crews could correct. Every hour flown chipped away at the fragile balance inside the nacelle. The numbers on the forms were more than statistics. They were a rolling countdown to the next failure. Under this tempo, the design's weaknesses became a cascade, each link in the chain tightening under the strain. The next step in the chain is what happens when cooling and airflow fall behind the engine's relentless heat. Heat was the first domino. The B-29's nacelle was a tight box built for speed and drag reduction, not for airflow. Curtiss Wright's R-3350 was already a challenge to keep cool, but Boeing's installation left the rear row of cylinders starved for fresh air. Wartime cooling analyses, later confirmed by computational fluid dynamics, showed that the back cylinders ran 100 to 150 degrees hotter than the front, sometimes tipping past 600 degrees Fahrenheit under full power. The baffles and cowl flaps, meant to channel air, couldn't overcome the basic geometry. The front row blocked the breeze, the turbocharger dumped extra heat, and the rear cylinders baked in their own exhaust. But it wasn't just temperature. The carburetor elbow, crammed into the induction system to save space, split the fuel-air mixture unevenly. Some cylinders ran rich, others dangerously lean. Lean cylinders get hot enough for pre-ignition and detonation, especially at 2,600 RPM climbing out of a Pacific Island airstrip, bomb bay loaded, ambient temperature already high. Field reports and teardown logs from the Marianas document this pattern. Burned pistons and valves always traced back to the same cylinders, always the ones with the worst airflow and the leanest mixture. Boeing's choices, tight nacelle, minimal baffle clearance, that sharp elbow in the intake, locked the R-3350 into a cycle of chronic overheating and uneven combustion. The engine was being asked to deliver maximum power with a cooling margin that barely existed. Every sortie risked pushing one cylinder too far. When that happened, the next failure in the chain was already set in motion. A single valve, running too hot in the back row, could start the chain reaction that destroyed a B-29. The R-3350's exhaust valves were hammered by heat and stress, especially those starved for cooling and fed a lean fuel-air mix. When the temperature climbed past 600 degrees Fahrenheit, the metallurgy could not keep up. The valve face would start to recede into its seat, eroding the margin that kept combustion gases out of the guide. Sometimes, in minutes, the stem would overheat, soften, and snap. That is what crews meant by a swallowed valve. The head would break off, bounce around the combustion chamber at 2,600 revolutions per minute, and punch through the top of the piston like a bullet. Now the real violence began. Shattered fragments tore through the cylinder wall. Oil, under pressure, sprayed into the breech, right onto the exhaust manifold, which glowed cherry red after a heavy climb. The same breach let raw fuel and superheated gases escape, feeding a fire that no extinguisher could touch. If the breach was deep enough, it would cut into the magnesium crankcase. Oil and magnesium together burned hotter than any fuel fire, reaching over 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit. In seconds, the nacelle became a furnace. The wing spar, aluminum, never meant for that kind of heat, would begin to melt and fail. Army Air Force's depot logs told the tale. Top 5 cylinders replaced every 25 hours, entire engines swapped every 75 hours. Crews learned to watch for the first flutter in RPM or a sudden drop in oil pressure, signs that a valve had gone. They had less than a minute to feather the prop and hope the fire did not spread. The design left no margin for error. Once a valve failed, the rest of the engine followed, and the magnesium was waiting. Once the magnesium crankcase caught fire, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Magnesium, chosen for its lightness, was a pyrotechnic liability. At ignition, it burned at more than 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through the aluminum wing spar in under a minute. Oil, already leaking from a breached cylinder or shattered piston, sprayed directly onto the crankcase and exhaust manifold. The result was a self-feeding blaze. Standard carbon dioxide extinguishers, the only defense crews had, failed nearly 9 times out of 10. Water only made things worse, splitting into hydrogen and oxygen and feeding the inferno. Inside the nacelle, the temperature spike was instant and absolute. Magnesium doesn't just burn, it reacts with air, releasing so much heat that it vaporizes anything in contact. The firewall, meant to contain a routine oil fire, was little more than a speed bump. The wing's main spar, a channel of aluminum alloy, softened and then collapsed. In the Marianas, crews reported seeing entire engines drop away from the wing, trailing a comet's tail of white-hot debris. There was no time for heroics. Once the magnesium caught, structural failure was measured in seconds, not minutes. Depot reports tracked the aftermath. Nacelles reduced to slag, wings sheared off at the root, control cables fused into puddles. The fire didn't just destroy the engine, it took the aircraft and everyone aboard. The mechanism was brutally simple. Once magnesium, oil, and oxygen ignited, nothing on board could stop the chain. The only choice left was to jump or ride it in. The R-2800 Double Wasp, built by Pratt & Whitney, sets the benchmark for what a heavy radial should be. No magnesium crankcase, no tightrope walk on cooling margins. In service from 1939, it powered the P-47 Thunderbolt, F-4U Corsair, and B-26 Marauder through the worst the war could throw at them. Crews brought home aircraft with cylinders shot off, oil pressure sagging, even a piston missing. The engine did not catch fire and melt the spar. The R-2800's steel and aluminum case could take punishment. Its exhaust ports all faced aft, so any fire or runaway heat vented behind the nacelle, not into the wing. Carburation was conservative, no sharp elbows, no lean cylinders waiting to detonate. Cooling baffles were generous, the airflow geometry robust. Maintenance logs from the field show overhaul intervals 2 to 3 times longer than the R-3350. The numbers are blunt. The R-2800's aircraft suffered far fewer catastrophic engine fires, and when they did, the structure usually survived. This was not luck. The Truman Committee, tasked with rooting out wartime production failures, grilled Curtiss-Wright executives over engine defects, quality lapses, and the decision to ship engines with known overheating and valve issues. The committee transcripts are clear. Curtiss-Wright prioritized speed and volume, chasing production quotas at the expense of testing and tight tolerances. Magnesium was chosen to shave weight and costs, not to protect the men flying the plane. Pratt & Whitney, by contrast, stuck to proven materials and methods. Their engines were not immune to failure, but they did not turn minor faults into infernos. The difference lay in manufacturing, discipline, and design conservatism. The losses of the B-29 were not inevitable. The rival engine proved that reliability was possible, even under the pressure of war. The question was never if the technology could work. It was whether the manufacturer would build it right and whether the schedule would allow it. Direct fuel injection changed everything. By delivering fuel straight into each cylinder, the post-war R-3350 finally solved the mixture imbalance that had plagued so many wartime engines. No more carburetor elbows starving the hottest cylinders. Cooling was next. Engineers redesigned the baffles and widened the nacelle, letting air reach every cylinder equally. The magnesium crankcase, once a pyre waiting for a spark, was replaced by stronger alloys and better oil management. Valve metallurgy improved. Sodium-filled exhaust valves carried heat away, and new guides kept them seated, even at full power. But the real leap was turbo compounding. 3 exhaust-driven turbines, each spinning at over 20,000 revolutions per minute, recovered energy from the hot exhaust and fed it back into the crankshaft. That meant 550 extra horsepower at takeoff with no added fuel. Brake-specific fuel consumption dropped to 0.4 pounds per horsepower-hour, a number unmatched by any piston engine of the era. Time between overhauls soared to 3,500 hours. What had once been a mechanic's nightmare became a workhorse for the world's airlines. Lockheed's Constellation and Douglas's DC-7 both adopted the turbo-compound R-3350. These airliners set distance records and crossed oceans on schedules the B-29 crews could only imagine. The same engine that once threatened to burn through a wing spar in minutes now carried passengers from New York to Paris, with fuel efficiency rivaling the best diesels. Airline performance logs from the 1950s and the 1960s tell the story. Thousands of hours between failures set a new standard for reliability. The R-3350 was never a cursed design. When engineers finally had the time and resources to finish the job, the engine delivered everything Curtiss Wright had promised on paper. The numbers, horsepower, fuel consumption, and overhaul intervals became proof. What wartime urgency had broken, post-war engineering redeemed. Every catastrophic fire, every swallowed valve traces back to decisions made at a drafting table under wartime pressure. Magnesium, tight cowlings, uneven fuel, all solved, but only after too many crews paid the price. Today, engineering still battles the clock. The lesson stands. It's not the design that kills, but the deadline. Precision saves lives, and haste writes the casualty lists. What is the cost of getting it wrong next time?